So, where are we now? Many of you are familiar with these. Goals 2000 came out in 94. As we got closer to 2000, it became apparent we weren't getting anywhere near achieving the goals that were set in 94. One of the, where's Heather Monroe? Oh, shouldn't mention people if they're not here. She pays attention to the early childhood crew. They were all supposed to come to school ready to learn, and the kindergarten teachers used to say, okay, we'll just send those kids home who weren't ready. And they can just stay at home until they come and they're ready. So we had those goals. We weren't making it, but it was about them not as people, but as future workers. Economic issues, employment, and making the public feel better. Now, some of you may have heard of No Child Left Behind. And Race to the Top was an effort to, what do they say now, incentivize people working towards No Child Left Behind. Again, economic needs and students as future workers in their employment notions, or their employment goals. And the latest one, I don't know what to make of it, was signed during the Christmas holidays. I always think that might have been intentional. December of 2015, called it's a nice name, Every Student Succeeds Act, the SSA. And again, the same theme, employment. And again, for the practitioners to change their ways and make the public feel that something was being done about the disaster of education. At another time, Linda Darling-Hammond, some of you know her work, on how our educational system has never been the disaster everyone's claimed it's been. It needs a lot of work, but it's not a disaster. But what we have here is a stream of arguments. I'm going backwards because I turned it upside down. Never turn things upside down. Or maybe do that to think differently. Sometimes it's useful. So we could try that out for a few minutes. So the arguments tended to be, in some ways, the moral and ethical, the right thing to do. If we believe in democracy, the right thing to do is. And that could be connected to the notion of the moral position. What are people's rights in a democracy? And it's helpful to remember that until the early 1900s, we didn't even think children had rights. So now we are very much agreeing that that's the case, but maybe we're not sure how we all define what those rights are. There's the philosophical and the theoretical, and it's no surprise that I am comfortable talking about and hopefully interpreting accurately John Dewey's work. I went to Ohio State. Yes, we called it Ohio State, not the Ohio State. Where Dewey had quite an influence on the curriculum of the laboratory school there and the College of Education. But those don't necessarily hold sway in the policy environment. Somehow talking about what's the right thing to do doesn't achieve what we hope. And here I'm bringing in a great social commentator of our current environment, John Oliver. Some of you may know his work. It's on YouTube, usually right after he does it on HBO. He recently had a piece on the Flint, Michigan water crisis, but he broadened it to include the fact that there are deteriorating water systems throughout the United States, particularly in urban areas and in the older cities, where we have an issue of lead, and that we ought to start doing something about it. By the way, it would provide lots of jobs for people. He called it lead abatement. But in spite of the congressional group who were lamenting what was going on in Flint, and he cleverly had some videotaping of that, where they were saying, my goodness, it's poison, and these are children. And then they vote down efforts to try and dedicate money to lead abatement strategies. So the moral and the philosophical don't seem to hold today. So he introduced, and some people are trying to use the research approach. For every dollar spent, at least in his little example, would return between $17 and $21 in increased productivity and decreased healthcare costs. So if you can't do it through ethics, philosophy, and a moral commitment, let's try some research. So in that regard, it's not political and economic from the standpoint of seeing our people we serve merely as engines of an economy or workers, but rather using those arguments to try and get the right thing done. What was I doing? Well, briefly, as I get embarrassed by this, I did start off teaching in French. It was driven by quantitative research, they told me, having to do with scripted teaching, literally scripted teaching. I would write my own script. That was at least something. But I followed what was called the audiolingual method in teaching French, which meant students parroted back to me everything that I was doing with them in my teaching. It was research-based, but it was research-based in behaviorism. And somewhere in my, not too many months into it, and by French 3, when I was teaching in French 3, I didn't do that anymore, but I didn't tell them. You can do that then. You can sort of hide behind things. Accountability for teachers then was based on how well you follow the script. And we were searching for universal truths about how people learn. This is the way, and it was usually with rats, by the way. And don't ask me what happened to the rat I had. It was like a little pet, actually, in an undergraduate course. I try not to think about what happened to him later. And it was a he, by the way. So we go on to what was happening in the 70s in my own life. Early 70s, I read Ross Mooney's piece. Some of you who've been in my classes remember that. And it has a gender bias, but we forgive him since he wrote it first in 1957. It was the researcher himself. And it was the notion that who does the research matters. Who we are matters. Now, we make that public. We don't let people guess where we're coming from philosophically, but we acknowledge that no matter what, we are driven by our own passions, by our own interests, by our own knowledge base. And speaking of knowledge base, you can hear that in the work of Elliot Eisner, who also said, we are real people doing the work we do, and we should use that for good purposes. I also had one of the strangest and infrequent dissertations at Ohio State in content analysis. It was a qualitative research study in the midst of everybody doing quasi-experimental research. That was what was in the program. And by the way, I did think statistics was a hoot. I told people that. Okay, give me some numbers, I'll do some stuff. And by the way, we didn't have computer programs. You love hearing that stuff from old people, don't you? But we, okay, it's real cool, and it's kind of neat to see what happens with that stuff. But I didn't have any research questions in that area. So I fell into and had a wonderful mentor who fostered my work in content analysis at that point. But I figured that at that time, not only did my positioning matter, but also the people who are participating in my studies matter too. Listening to them, understanding them, and appreciating the knowledge they have that is also legitimate knowledge. There was then beginning, because of that Cloudman report, in our early 70s in the U.S., an inkling that something was going on in England that was really powerful with regard to early education, and we called it, clumsy phrase, the British Infant School Movement. And we, of course, love movements in the U.S. So it was a movement. We had lots of teachers spending their summers going to England, visiting classrooms. So that was a really cool thing to do on your summer vacation as well. But streams of people going over there. Sadly, when people returned, somehow it didn't seem quite the same thing. So I was asking questions about why not? What are we missing? And for those of you who've had some qualitative research, you can see that it led easily into the notion of let's study what they are doing carefully to see then what is underlying it, rather than break visits of 2 hours or whatever in a given classroom. So my first sabbatical from UNF was an ethnographic case study of one school in England. It was called the middle school because they were the upper elementary, 8 to 12-year-olds. And that set me off into 20 years of work related to what they were doing in England and how it might relate to our work here. Qualitative research, every piece of it, because of the nature of the research questions I kept asking. I also wanted to know how expert teachers over there, and I didn't plan to say this, but how did expert teachers over there learn to be expert teachers? And I'm a teacher ed as well. I was waiting for them in my carefully honed, semi-structured, in-depth interview questions to say it was all about their teacher preparation programs and those wonderful people who supported them. Can you guess who they thought were the main people who helped them become really good at what they were doing? Their colleagues. They were in schools where they talked a lot with each other all the time. And they studied together, they shared, and they developed. Now, their initial prep worked for the first year, and I think now that's where we're at in teacher ed. Get people ready for the first year or two. But it's your colleagues, again, back to relationships. So what happened when I came back after that first journey was kind of funny. I went to AERA in 1983 with my 43-page presentation, and I was really young then. I walked into the room. There were 4 other people on the program for that one session. AERA gives you about 10, 12 minutes, so this is a blessing today. Standing room only. Now, remember I said Quan was the dominant from the late 50s through most of the 70s. Somehow, somewhere, there was a turning in the field to see qualitative research as legitimate work to develop knowledge that we haven't had. And there weren't that many presentations going on at AERA that year, so they all flocked to this one ethnography presentation, and that was a really scary situation. So you're not quite as bad as that one, but you're scary enough. So by the end of the 80s, we were pretty much comfortable with what we were doing in the field, although in many ways it was seen as a battleground, qualitative versus quantitative. After it was a battleground, it became a debate, like which was better. We have left that behind, thankfully. We have knowledge to develop in research. There's knowledge that's driven by a need to know. I should ask some of my people who were from last term, but I'll save you from that. How do measurable variables relate to each other? The key thing being to be identifying variables and get that worked out and then measure them and then see what they do with each other. And obviously that takes us into the world of statistics. That's good knowledge. That's knowledge we desperately need. I'm looking at Rain back there. I want to know how many people die from physical therapy. It'd be kind of nice to know, since I seem to find myself in it every day. And then there's the knowledge of what is going on in places. This is Warren Hodges' favorite term. What's going on here? The knowledge of people, particularly people who haven't been asked to share their knowledge. We put them in a category now, we call them marginalized. But, you know, who knows where that really is? But people have never been asked, and they have knowledge. And we as researchers need to capture that knowledge and share that, because otherwise policy is pretty off the mark if it's not going to stretch out and have a meaningful impact with people who are in those environments where policy is supposed to make a difference.